Ashleigh Banfield is a veteran anchor and television journalist whose work has raised her to the highest echelons of TV news. The Winnipeg native had a steady ascent in TV journalism in the U.S. over more than 30 years, where she has hosted and anchored programs on Court TV, CNN, HLN, and most recently, NewsNation, where she now hosts an eponymous show. Banfield has been a correspondent for ABC News and NBC News. She's done award-winning reporting from around the world, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, England, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. She has interviewed presidents, prime ministers, and celebrities along the way. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TV News Check, and this is Inside the Media, the show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. Today, a conversation with Ashleigh Banfield, looking back at her career and forward to a news landscape that has changed dramatically during its course. Welcome, Ashleigh.
Hello.
Very happy to have you here. Ashleigh, as I mentioned at the top, you are from Winnipeg, educated in Ontario and British Columbia. Who were your Canadian journalism heroes growing up? Who did you see as models?
So first and foremost, I grew up in the era of like Knowlton Nash, so that goes back. And then, of course, Peter Mansbridge and Barbara Frum. And I remember watching Barbara Frum every night with my parents. And my parents, for whatever reason, must have had an idea that I was a bit of a curiosity seeker and a journalist at heart, and said, one day you're going to be Barbara Frum. And it was either that or Connie Chung. And so looking south of the border, it was Connie Chung, and north of the border, it was Barbara Frum. And then as time sort of went on, I remember when I was working in Calgary, I would listen to As It Happens every Friday, specifically as I was driving out to the mountains, and I would listen to Alan Maitland and Michael Enright, and loved them, just loved the way their spirit came through in their journalism. And I remember thinking, that's how I want to be. That's how I want to ask questions. I want to ask questions as a normal person, not as an anchor cyborg.
You began your TV journalism career at CHCO-TV in Canada, but pretty quickly you shifted over to the US, where the majority of your career has developed.
Gosh, Michael, I actually even went smaller than that. Okay. I started in Kenora, Ontario, population like 15,000 people. And next door was Keewatin, population 2,000, where the station really was. And I was not only the photographer, the writer, the anchor, I was also the director and the producer. So I would hit my foot on the floor when I wanted the master controller to roll a tape behind me. Wow. It was the most rudimentary production ever. And so that's where I really started in 1988, was in this little tiny station in Keewatin, Ontario, and then went to Winnipeg, CKY, and then went to Edmonton, CFRN, and then ended up in Calgary. So there was a Canadian progression along the way.
Okay. But you did shift fairly early in your career over to the US. So why did you decide to pursue your career there?
Well, I'll tell you what, as I watched so much news growing up, I grew up in the era of Beirut being the lead story on, the CBC National News and the CTV National News. And I remember thinking, well, that's really something I'd like to do. And I just recall seeing so much more of it in the US. And I remember feeling as though that it was a bigger business down south, and there was much more opportunity down south. But the thing that really ignited me and sort of pushed me south of the border was honestly, the rejection in Canada. I tried desperately to get a job at the CBC, and I was just never given an opportunity there. And I feel like it's embarrassing, actually, to the CBC to have rejected me so, repeatedly, especially in Vancouver, where I got a letter from a news director saying, while persistence is the hallmark of a good reporter, please don't, apply here anymore. And I think that was after 3 phone calls over the course of 4 months to see if I could have a meeting with them. Pretty sad, you know. So Canada eats its own, it turns out, a little bit.
I think they may change their mind if
I had a really interesting meeting with Peter Mansbridge a few years ago in Toronto. There was a RTNDA conference, I think it was, and I was speaking at it, and Peter was there. And I recounted my experience with the CBC, both in Calgary and in Vancouver, and he was mortified. And he said he was going to take it to the board, and he did. And so through my conversation subsequently with Peter Mansbridge, at least the board was aware of what, you know, of the journalist that they lost. I would have probably stayed in Canada a lot longer, but it just seemed like there was just so little advancement. And with that treatment and with that letter from Vancouver, I remember thinking, well, that's that. Bye.
Well, those things can be stinging. Absolutely. For those who might not be familiar with your latest show, Banfield, on News Nation in the US, can you briefly explain what the show is about and also the network that's presenting it?
Sure, with the accompaniment of Atlas, my 65-pound golden doodle barking in the background. We've all become used to that. So News Nation is a brand new cable news network that was launched by Perry Sook and the Nexstar news conglomerate, which is now the largest station owner in the United States. And Perry Sook had the vision of having, a cable news network to go along with his 200 local stations, because he'd seen the polarization proliferate so terribly in the American cable news landscape. And so with the, philosophical silos that had developed with MSNBC and Fox News, and to a great extent CNN, he decided it was time to launch a very centrist news channel that went back to the principles of unbiased news and opinionless news. Go figure. So I jumped at that opportunity, and I'm doing the 10 o'clock primetime program called Banfield on News Nation. And I couldn't be more thrilled to be in at the ground floor, and literally we're still building this network. So we still have many more hours of the day to create and produce and launch. And but by the end of this time next year, we'll be a 24-hour full-fledged opportunity for anybody looking for this kind of centrist programming.
So as someone who came up through network news and then cable, on the subject of polarization, how did things come to this level, this current level of polarization from your vantage point?
How the wheels fall off, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I kind of lived through it because I immigrated to the United States 26 and a half, almost 27 years ago. And at that time, CNN was the only game in town, and they just did the news. Ted Turner's mission was, to do the news. And they were, excoriated, castigated, laughed at from the beginning, called Chicken Noodle News Network. And they had the last laugh. And then along came Fox and MSNBC in the late, 90s. I think it was 98, 99-ish, somewhere around there. And all of a sudden, it was a competitive environment. Roger Ailes had a very clever strategy, and that was to give a television option to all of the daytime talk radio listeners in the United States, because it was a very, very conservative audience that had really, taken to talk radio, but had no outlet on television. And so he seized that market very adeptly, and we can see that has held, all these years. MSNBC a little more slow to take that, hint and realize he'd already captured that market. Eventually, over the course of about 8-9 years, started to really fly over to the other side and pull in the left audience. CNN kind of didn't know what to do, and it seemed as though they waffled in the middle, thinking that would work for them, and ultimately ended up just gravitating with hosts who took them left. It really, I think, culminated in the Trump years, where perhaps the president at the time, Jeff Zucker, had a personal issue with Donald Trump. The two of them were at loggerheads quite often. They had worked together in entertainment, and Trump was very vociferous about deriding Jeff Zucker. And I think Zucker said, well, let's prove him wrong.
And the strategy paid off, didn't it? I mean, they were rewarded with record ratings that have since dropped since.
But what's interesting is that everybody in the Trump era was rewarded with record ratings. I don't think we can ascribe that to CNN alone. I mean, there was just this crazy, news cycle that never ended. And there was just sort of this vomiting of new, freakish, insane developments every hour, literally for 5 years. Maybe more during the campaign and then the 4-year, administration. So, but that comes at a price. You take your top off on TV, everybody will watch, but then eventually they'll know exactly what you are. And I think that's what CNN began to suffer, because there is a great hue and a cry about those who say you profess to be centrist, but you're not. And I have no issue with those who wear their brand and admit freely what the brand is, but they can't cloak themselves in the news label. That's not fair.
I want to dig into some of the conventions of news with you, especially TV news, that might be feeding the trust problem that the industry currently faces. And one is the adjacency of news opinion shows with the presentation of more straightforward reporting. So what's your take on the structure there? Are too many viewers conflating news and opinion programming, and are the networks essentially feeding that conflation?
Well, I think the opinion has bled into the news, right? So it used to be that the rationale was no different than a newspaper. You have your editorial pages, your op-eds, and then you've got your news section, and they were very obvious. Like one was obviously an opinion and the other was the headlines and the news. And I know that Roger Ailes ascribed to that theory as well, saying, I've got my daytime programming and I've got my opinionated hosts at night. So it's tricky, because there's not a big old label that suggests that. You don't get a op-ed primetime. You just, get 4 o'clock into 5 o'clock into 6 o'clock.
You probably could tweak your chyrons, but sure, yeah.
Yeah. The graphics were a little different, and the names were different. But then I think the bigger problem is that people started to see where bread got buttered, and then started to snatch little pieces of that. Megyn Kelly was in Dayside and was very obvious with her opinion and her right wing decision to come at a right wing viewpoint, and was rewarded handsomely with a primetime show. And so a lot of hosts have seen that, and so I think that you'll see a lot of people in daytime. I watch it every day and I see exactly where their opinions come in, even if it's the way they raise their eyebrows. It doesn't need to be in a script and it doesn't need to be spelled out, but it is in the way the interviewer asks the questions, the kinds of questions they ask, and their obvious, reaction, and then their visceral reactions. And so a lot of what's happening at night bleeds into Dayside. And now you're right. It becomes, too difficult to discern for a viewer who's just trying to live their life, get the news when they can, in bits and snaps, and it all seems like it's news, but it's not.
So perhaps a stoicism in interviewing is not being rewarded, and one needs to start. It's interesting how insidious that can become, and how minute a detail can.
I don't think it's a stoicism. I think there's plenty of room for personality, right? I mean, we're all people, we're all animals, we're communicators, we're social beings at heart, and there's no reason we can't provide the news as people. Again, we can't cloak ourselves in opinion and still maintain that we're unbiased. If you're going to be what you're going to be, say it out loud and then do it, But it's this disingenuousness that I think America's catching up with and they're frustrated with.
Panels are another very popular convention in TV news. You get a small group of usually professional pundits across a table representing the political spectrum, and you toss them scraps of news to chew over. And those who chew the loudest and the most dramatically often seem to be rewarded to keep returning. That's my characterization. Do you think that's fair, or is that too harsh?
I mean, there's an element of fairness and an element of it being too harsh, because I look at Rachel Maddow having been a regular panelist on MSNBC and was rewarded with, Keith Olbermann's 9 o'clock slot. I don't think she was the loudest. I just think that she was well researched and thoughtful in the way she communicated, and that worked well for programming. It's not always that the most strident gets the show, they don't get rewarded with their own, eponymous show. Usually it's if they resonate. And there's nothing wrong with smart, there's absolutely nothing wrong with smart. John King is smart. And he was, for a long time, he was a correspondent, and he was on the board doing the election results. Very matter of fact, and he got a show. I wouldn't say John King.
For Canadian audiences, John King, CNN reporter, famous for the magic wall and how he operates that during U.S. election coverage.
Exactly. And I wouldn't be surprised if Steve Kornacki ends up getting a show on MSNBC, because he also has his version of the magic wall, and it's Kornacki's khakis. He looks like a high school teacher when he does his election results. But sometimes actually the trend has gone the opposite way. The noisier and more obnoxious ones are actually not preferred.
Mm-hmm. Well, panels, though, relative to the cost of sending people out into the field and producing news, panels are a whole lot cheaper to do. I mean, in your experience, is that sort of a practical problem that producers are running against, and that's why we see so many of them?
Well, early on in the cable strategy, the idea is that reporters and crews are expensive, and it takes an entire day to put together a 2-minute report, right? But you could do a 7-minute conversation with someone on the left and someone on the right, and you ostensibly moderating the screaming match between them. And so early on, that's kind of where cable went, like in the early 2000s when the competition began, and all of a sudden we started to see these, a real gravitation towards politics as opposed to what CNN was doing, which was mostly just news, right? Lots of international, lots of Capitol Hill. So it was very inexpensive to have 2 free guests, right? Because they wanted to hang their shingle out and show the world what they were doing and sell what they were, their widgets. And then it sort of grew to, rather than just having 2 debaters, it grew to be the panel of debaters. And again, fairly inexpensive, because none of them typically charged, although we have grown into the age of paid contributorship. And if you look on CNN, about every second person is CNN contributor, which means they're being paid to be analysts for that network. They try to basically rope them in and keep them from the other networks when they find a good one. But it is very inexpensive programming given the alternative.
There's also, I want to tackle the idea of false equivalence. You bring together 2 opposing sides of an argument and make it look like they hold equal weight when in fact they don't. What's your view on the prevalence of that problem in the industry?
Right, like suggesting that we should have an equivalent debate when Marjorie Taylor Greene says there are Jewish space lasers, something like that, right?
Yes.
It's crazy. I mean, but then again, people also weaponize that term to suggest that if someone has an opposing side, it's a false equivalency. So I think you can, there are gradations in that debate. Absolutely, I think people fell into an emergency need to have an opposing view sometimes when there just wasn't one, right? Like, it's just not right to break the glass at the Capitol. It's not right to take a swing at a police officer and push past him into the Capitol. There's no equivalency. Right. You will see others who say, but we're never being listened to. And we were at the protest, which was, half a mile away, and we're being branded all with the same brush. We had the right to say we believe in Trump and we think there should be, better, election auditing. They have the right to say that. That's what America's built on. But people take it too far and then start to give the equivalency to those who are actually committing crimes. So it's where you draw the line to where the equivalency becomes just foolhardy.
Do you think that the TV news industry is even capable of winding back its use of sort of these bad habits at this point, or is it really locked into a path that it shouldn't be going down?
So I'll tell you right now, we're the only cable network that's growing. They're shedding viewers, and through attrition, maybe they'll catch on. That Americans are actually really, really exhausted, right? They are polarized. They do enjoy their silos. They do enjoy an echo chamber, but ultimately they also do want to be informed. And many of them have been eating Cheetos, not realizing there's a salad bar next door. So I think for the most part, every time I speak to somebody about this new cable channel and its mission, I get the same reaction, a one-word reaction that is refreshing. So I do think there's a great appetite for those who are frustrated when they go out and they have a conversation with their friend group, and all of a sudden the friend group has an opposing view, and they haven't heard it, and they haven't heard it backed up with fact. And that's annoying. So when you have an unbiased news channel, you allow both sides to discuss maturely why they believe what they believe and what facts and data they bring to the conversation. And you don't have to go back and forth between news channels to even hear that there's another side, or even to hear that there's another story, you know?
It seems as though we're in a transformational moment in terms of how the news anchor is presenting him or herself to the audience. We're shifting away from the kind of rigid, authoritative voice of past generations and moving into something different. And you started to touch on this before. What do you see happening there?
I don't see a whole lot of difference in terms of all kinds of communication. I mean, even if you listen to dialect and to accents, those have changed. Just go back and listen to some of the old newsreels and how they would present. They had an accent and they had a different way of talking. And even Katharine Hepburn had a different way of talking. We just change, right? We evolve as a society. We have a much greater comfort level with being just natural communicators rather than, as I say, anchor cyborgs. And that's not to dismiss what Walter Cronkite did. He was incredible in his day, and it was exactly what was needed and what was expected. But those things shift, right? And we do demand a little bit more transparency, authenticity, and honesty from our anchors now. And that comes not just in what we say, but in how we say it, how we communicate. Is it coming from Ashleigh, or is it coming from fake Ashleigh? I think they prefer it comes from Ashleigh.
I know I talk to a lot of reporters and anchors of color, and women particularly, who feel only in the last couple of years they've been able to present themselves, their hair, the way they dress, just the way they present themselves physically, and then how they choose to address the audience in a way that is more natural to them. But it's a recent phenomenon.
I have some of those ridiculous cocktail sausage casing dresses still hanging up in that closet upstairs. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago that was the uniform, right? If you're going to be a woman on cable news, you better have one of those extremely tight-fitting, sleeveless dresses, so tight you can barely fit the mic pack in. And I defy you, just go watch cable news for a little while and you'll see that mic pack sticking out of the tight dress in the back. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. It's why I've completely dispensed with that. I wear a white Oxford shirt or a white shirt pretty much every time I broadcast now, because I've kind of had it with the notion that somehow women on the news have to be dressed for some event.
Right, exactly. Those who work in TV news have been the subject of more direct attacks and harassment than ever before. What has been your own experience with that?
Oh, I mean, hideous, you know. Although I try to mitigate how I feel about it, only because I am quite certain that in the 80s and the 90s, when I was on television, there would be someone sitting on a couch somewhere saying like, ugh, I can't stand her. And that's fine, right? Everybody's entitled to
tweet it, right?
They're just not amplifying it to, 300,000 people and then ultimately saying it to you directly. And that's what social media has afforded them. And I think if more people really knew what they were doing, like the net effect of what they were doing when they take to the keyboard with their lightning fingers and their immediate unedited vitriol, the inner ugly, we all have it. We all have an inner ugly. We've all thrown peanuts at the TV screen. Ugh, don't care for him. Ugh, I wish he'd take a hike. But if they really knew the net effect of what they were doing, I think they wouldn't do it. I honestly do think that the people behind some of the ugliest stuff that comes out from a keyboard actually aren't that person. I just think it's a really tiny piece of them that just sneaked out without a governor.
We're living in a time of exponential uncertainty. Do you think that the news has a remaining power to help us deal with that?
I think it's the only thing, right? Listen, there's something about cable news that brings a real person in real time into your home to recount what's happening now. And that's unparalleled. Social media, not very trustworthy, far too large, it's too unwieldy. So I think that the news is always going to have a place for Americans and Canadians and a global audience as well, because we all want to know what's happening, right? We all want to know the State of the Union at all times, not just on January 20th. We all want to know if we're going to be okay. Not to suggest that the news will tell you that, but at least it gives you a formula with which you can deal with your day.
Mentoring has become an important topic for you personally. Can you tell me briefly what the work you've been doing on that front?
Yeah, I launched an initiative back in November called Rising Tide. Obviously, after the famous JFK Rising Tide lifts all boats, which wasn't his to start with. He actually used the quote from someone else, but it became famous because of John F. Kennedy. And it is true. I have always felt a rising tide lifts all boats. It started among women in the industry when I was a young woman coming up in the industry, and women just would not help each other because they felt there was no room at the top. Turned out there was a large platform at the top. If we'd all helped each other out, it certainly made a big difference for everybody. And so as I grew up in the 80s and 90s through this business, I just yearned for a mentor, or just a few people I could turn to for advice, and never had it. And I don't think a lot of the men had it either, or at least maybe if men did have it, they were too tough to ask for the help. So I think now, as I look back on 34 years of accruing all of this information, good and bad, I think I can help people leapfrog some of the pain and suffering, that I went through, and also, maximize on some of the benefits that I learned along the way. And I just, honestly, I just dug into my Rolodex. Michael, I just accrued all these friends in the business, and they're in high places. And so I started calling and saying, would you do this? Would you take a half hour and answer the questions of young people in the business who are trying to get their start? And really, almost invariably, everyone said yes.
So Ashleigh, where can Canadians find the show? Can they find it social media, YouTube?
So we stream on all major platforms, YouTube TV and Fubo and Hulu and all the rest. On News Nation Now streams everywhere. And newsnationnow.com, News Nation Now. So there's a couple of N's in there. That has all the information on channel finders. It's a little tricky for Canadians. It's not impossible. But sooner rather than later, I'm sure it's going to get a lot less tricky for, I remember when I started at MSNBC, my parents couldn't watch, my brothers couldn't watch because they didn't have it in Canada. Well, they sure do now. So, as we grow, Canada will become, I think, a critical market. I think a lot of Americans look very differently to Canada than they did when I was growing up. I think it's forced to be reckoned with. It's an important trading partner. It's an important cultural factor. The news out of Ottawa recently with the truckers, that made big news down here as well. So Canada matters. And I think most stations and networks and broadcasters believe that.
Well, Ashleigh Banfield, thank you so much for lending a half hour of your time here today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for asking, Michael. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks to all of you for watching. You can watch past episodes on Facebook and YouTube. And I'll see you next time on Inside the Media, where we will take another close look at how the news works.